We begin our video program number 3 for a Catholic overview of the Bible with this representation of the tabernacle from an old Bible dictionary which shows 2 uppermost coverings removed. On Mount Sinai, Moses received from God the design for this tabernacle, a house for the suitable worship of God. In the year after their arrival at Sinai and the establishing of the covenant, they accomplished the building with the Spirit of God inspiring the lead designer, Bezalel, and filling him, to quote from Exodus, with ability, intelligence, with knowledge, and with all craftsmanship to devise artistic designs, to work in gold and silver and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, and in carving wood and work of every skilled craft. A framework of acacia wood, vases of silver, beautiful tapestries, figures of cherubim covered in gold to guard the ark, curtains with the richest dyes of violet, purple, and scarlet, hung with loops of violet threads and gold clasps. It was made to be the throne room for Yahweh, with outer courts for the service of his ministers, and all is covered with goat's skin, and over that the red-dyed skin of dugong, which is a seal-like mammal found in the Red Sea. The whole assemblage, with elaborate planning and ceremony, could be taken down and carried in precise order by Levites and priests to the next place of settlement. To build the residing place of God, as he traveled with them on their journey, demanded the work of the whole community. Under the direction of Bezalel, women set to work weaving cloth for the tent curtains. This is Pharaoh's, Tutankhamun's, cedar wood chest that was carried on 4 poles and dates from 1400 BC. Moses had seen things like this, so when God described a similar chest to be the ark to carry the law, Moses knew how it could be adapted and adorned for the holy task of carrying the 10 Commandments. Egyptians also had portable pavilions without curtains, and this one dates from 2600 BC and was built for Pharaoh Hetepheres. It was along these lines that the portable tabernacle also had its form. God works through what man offers, transcending and infusing its earthly value with new purpose and meaning. The tabernacle was constructed so that God might dwell in their midst during their travels. God's detailed instructions for this portable sanctuary included the great tabernacle tent that would house the ark, which is marked A, B, the bronze laver for the priest's ablutions, C, the altar for burnt offerings, and D, the linen curtains that formed the courtyard. Growing in the wilderness of Paran, the acacia tree was used in the building of the tabernacle. Also, part of the great enterprise of religion was the making of all the priestly garments. The notable garment was apron-like, called the ephod, which was covered by the breastpiece. 12 gemstones representing the 12 tribes and engraved with their names were placed upon the breastpiece. The breastpiece, held on the chest with shoulder straps, also holds a pouch. The nation symbolically rested on the high priest by this breastpiece, and he continually carried the people of the 12 tribes into God's presence by wearing it. The pouch contained Urim and Thummim, the sacred lots which were drawn to determine the will of God. So, besides carrying the nation's concerns to God in the Holy of Holies via the symbolism of the breastpiece, the high priest was the announcer to the nation of God's will determined by drawing a lot from this pouch. A modern book of the Torah, one of the 5 books of the law, is written in Hebrew upon this scroll. The Torah is the written heart of Judaism, as the Gospels are the written heart of Christianity. A year of feasts for the Hebrews is arranged on a circular calendar. Note months on the wheel and how the Hebrew calendar correlates to our calendar. The dots around the edge mark times of feasts, which were days of seasons, or religious joy. Some were associated with the change of seasons, which to the Hebrew was the work of Creator for the benefit of man. When his people found pleasure in temporal things, the response was to thank God. And at appropriate times of the year it was necessary to make sacrifice for forgiveness of sin and reconciliation with God. It was also necessary to return to the Lord a portion from his bounty, and this was ritualized. With the feast, there was no sharp demarcation between sorrow, sacrifice, and joy. The first dot to the right of the center is the great feast of Passover in the month Nisan, which begins the year and which marked the deliverance from Egypt. The Feast of Unleavened Bread accompanied Passover on the 14th day of the first month, of which the homes were cleared of all leaven, and there was no work. The next dot is the Feast of Weeks, which was a feast of harvest and first fruits, later called Pentecost. It was held on the 50th day from the Sabbath that began the Passover. It called for a holy convocation and offering of sacrifice. It also marked the time of the great theophany of Sinai and the sealing of the covenant. Continuing clockwise, the third dot is the day of blowing the trumpets, which is the first day of Rosh Hashanah, followed by the 10th day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. On the 16th of the same month is the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, which was a feast of ingathering. Lasting 8 days, each day saw sacrificial offerings. The first and last were holy convocations. As the crop was gathered in, people dwelt out in the fields or the vineyards in booths made of branches of trees, which was a remembrance of their wanderings and God's provision for them. Between the Feast of Tabernacles and Purim, or the Feast of Esther, lies the minor festival of lights, or Hanukkah, which doesn't have a black dot. It has gained in importance in our time simply as a reason for a Jewish festival at the time of the Christian celebration of Christmas. Besides these yearly celebrations, each week the Feast of the Sabbath was enjoyed in every family. In this way, the year, the month, and the week were made God-centered. We attend the bar mitzvah of a Jewish boy, 12 or 13 years of age. He wears a prayer shawl and a yarmulke as he reads from the Torah for the first time in public and declares himself to be counted among the men of Israel. In this Orthodox Jewish home, the father prepares his son by placing on his forehead and on his hand the phylactery holding the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. This was the practice Moses prescribed for all Israel to be passed from generation to generation in order that Yahweh and his commandments not be forgotten. Bind them on your hand and place them on your forehead. In Jerusalem, a group of Orthodox Jews burn all the leaven from their homes before the Passover. Leaven is a symbol of evil, the way it invades and mysteriously affects the whole lump of dough. A housewife attacks the house for every crumb, and the children help, perhaps the beginning of our custom of spring house cleaning. Do young wives still do it? But much scrubbing and scouring went on before Passover in preparation for the 7 days of unleavened bread when Orthodox Jews eat no leaven. This still, a beautifully preserved monument honoring the law of Hammurabi, dates from 1700 to 1750 B.C. It declares that laws of justice and truth were given Hammurabi from Marduk, or Shamash, his gods. As a dweller in Mesopotamia, Abraham was acquainted with this law. It predates the 10 Commandments given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and shows us that justice and truth were always seen, even by pagans, as coming from heaven, even when the recipients had no knowledge of the true God. This may be the rock of Meribah in the Sinai, which is one of a number of above-ground aquifers holding thousands of gallons of water. When Moses struck it, the water gushed forth, but he was punished for striking the rock when God had commanded him only to speak to the rock, thereby taking glory to himself rather than giving God the glory. An Egyptian tomb painting shows trappers at work during the annual migration of quail along the Nile. Because of God's plan and timing in his creation, the quail arrived at the right time to answer the Israelites' cry for meat. We may wonder why they did not eat their animals, but that stock was essential for their future in Canaan, and if eaten would have left them destitute. Besides, feeding so many, their whole sustenance would have been destroyed in short order. Twice on their journey, the Israelites feasted on quail, which, exhausted by their migration, were an easy prey with a weighted blanket. These delicious treats were overindulged in to the point of sickness. The terebinth tree, sometimes mentioned in the Bible, is a species of oak acclimated to the harsh conditions of the Sinai. According to legend, Jesus was crucified on a terebinth. Kadesh Barnea is a place of springs in the northern Sinai. It was a place of rest for the wanderers, from which Moses sent out the spies to spy out the land, and where the people revolted against God and Moses, demanding to return to Egypt. Here they were condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Kadesh Barnea was a place to which they returned in their wanderings over those years, and from here, when the time was fulfilled, they finally set out around Edom and Moab to begin to lay claim to the land God had given them. An aerial view of the wadi, which included Kadesh Barnea. The surrounding country is the wilderness of Zin, which the Israelites in those 40 years knew well. Though barren, it does support sheep. On this topographic map, we note the trench of the great fault caused by continental drift that comes out of deep Africa, altogether 4,000 miles, and so affects the land of Israel. The Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level. At the bottom of the map, on the east of the Dead Sea, are the rugged lands of Edom and Moab that must be traversed by Israel in their journey. The spies sent out by Moses will walk through this land from south to north, though their starting point, Kadesh Barnea, is further south than this map shows. This is a second topographical map, again showing the Dead Sea, then the Jordan River running up to the Sea of Galilee, and to the east the hills of Moab, and in front of us the rough country of Judah, the plains along the Mediterranean Sea that are very rich and fertile. This is the country that we continue to call Israel. The Rift Valley, called the Arabah in the Bible, refers to the depressed but rough land that extends from the base of the Dead Sea to the Gulf of Aqaba of the Red Sea. It was well known to the Israelites in their desert wandering. The depression is hot, dry, and grows almost nothing. Perhaps it was into this depression that the grumbling rebels, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and their families were swallowed up into Sheol, for it is part of the great rift. Though not always this sandy and barren, the wilderness of Zin was the first land that met the spies. The rocks forced up from beneath are eroded by wind. This expanse of wilderness lies north of Kadesh Barnea and is on the southern edges of the Negeb, still part of the wilderness of Zin. Wilderness does not always mean desert. The Judean wilderness of the northern Negeb has 4 to 8 inches of rain per year and can support sheep as well as producing at times a landscape of flowers. Yet great areas of the Judean wilderness are truly badlands. Here refugees from political tyranny have found hiding places throughout Bible history. Moses' spies would have traversed this wilderness in their trek to reconnoiter the land. Here we look down on the hill country of Judah, a rough tumble of hills that farmers of ancient times began to terrace in order to grow their food. Bethlehem and Jerusalem lay in this region. The hills provided promontories upon which to build fortresses, like Jerusalem, that were more easily defended. As they went on to the north, the spies were awed by these strong-looking cities and their great walls. To the spies, the Jordan River would not have looked like this modern picture with its cultivation that is irrigated from the Jordan. In Moses' day, it was a wild jungle of vegetation that was respected by armies who knew its reputation of devouring troops. Continuing north, the 12 men, the spies, chosen from the tribes, finally came to the center of Canaan with its olive trees, pecans, and other orchards covering the hillside, and its fruitful vineyards and farmlands. This is the part of the country that will be known as Samaria in Jesus' day. The hillsides along the Sea of Galilee are fertile and have the moisture needed for many crops, orchards, and vineyards. This indeed looked to the spies like a land flowing with milk and honey. North of the Sea of Galilee lies the Beulah Valley, which in ancient times was swampy, and even in modern times malaria has been a deterrent to farming there. Today, however, the land produces a rich variety of vegetables for the tables of Israel. Rich agricultural land continues right to the base of the foothills of the mountains of Lebanon. Here in the distance is the site of the ancient city of Hazor, and to the northeast Dan at the foot of Mount Hermon, whose snows supply bounteous water for the area and flow down into the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and finally the Dead Sea. About here, the spies turned to go back to Moses with their report. The Canaanites were clearly blessed with a fruitful land, with orchards, vineyards, and gardens, and this was the country that God had promised to give his people. But how, when so many strong Canaanite cities blocked their way? To show their compatriots what lushness they had seen, the spies picked one bunch of grapes, so heavy it had to be carried on a pole between them, and back they went to the people waiting in the wilderness. They may have brought back beautiful fruit, but except for Caleb and Joshua, the spies brought back fearful stories of heavily fortified cities and giants who lived in them. The people, not believing that even God could give them such a land, rebelled against Moses and demanded to return to Egypt. So God condemned them to this wilderness for 40 years. The inhospitable Arabah was the site of their struggle back toward the Gulf of Aqaba during the next years. Here, seen off in the distance, is the welcome oasis at Ebion Gezer. It's at the southern end of the Arabah, before it ends at the Gulf, and it was the welcome sight that finally greeted the wandering people. From Ebion Gezer, the people moved up toward the north, and Moses asked for passage on the King's Highway. It's a track that is still used and which can be seen in this aerial photo. The king of Edom did not allow the hordes of Israel to use it. The hostility of Edom forced them to use the Wadi of the Zered. It's a river that borders Edom, a most inhospitable and difficult route to get through the hostile country. Then they faced the Moabite frontier forts. And Moab was no friendlier than Edom had been. It was the gorge of the Arnon River, which they were also forced to travel, and which served as the northern border of Moab. It was certainly no easier than the Zered had been. Finally reaching Moab's heights, they could see the Dead Sea and the cliffs of promised Canaan beyond. This picture from a book has a inconvenient crease down the middle, but it shows the people setting up their tents to rest on the plains of Moab. Here is where Balaam was hired by Balak, king of Moab, to curse them from the heights. But by God's command, Balak could only bless them. The first battles to occupy the land were on the east side of the Jordan and were fought under Moses' leadership. Their victories against the kings, who were more like Arab sheikhs, of Bashan and Heshbon, heartened the Israelites that they were really able to conquer Canaan. Here are statues of the two kings found in Ammon, Jordan, the Amorite kings, Og of Bashan and Sihon of Heshbon. This is Mount Nebo. From the top of Mount Nebo, Moses could only look over the Jordan and view the length of Canaan, the promised land, from Dan on the north to Beersheba on the south. Because of his disobedience at Meribah, he could not enter the land. This is another view of Mount Nebo in what is now Jordan. Here Moses, at 120 years of age, died still in vigorous health, and the Bible says that God buried him in the valley and that his grave is unknown to this day. And it truly is unknown to this day. The great statue of Moses by Michelangelo catches the strength and the godliness of the greatest man of the Old Testament. The strange horns on his head are the result of a mistranslation of the Hebrew text. The Hebrew text told of rays of light coming from his head, but the Vulgate Bible used by Michelangelo in a mistake by St. Jerome had translated it as horns instead of rays. In his last discourse to the people he had led so well, Moses pleads with them to obey God and not forget the covenant they had pledged with God. In the land they will soon enter, he fears the pleasures, the temptations, the false worship of the Canaanites, not their power, which he knows God will overcome. Here a Canaanite nobleman exhibits all the trappings of wealth that Moses was rightly worried would infect the people and cause them to lose their center in the true God. Among the pleasures of Canaan were beverages, probably beer, served by a slave, golden jewelry, music, sometimes considered decadent by the Jews. These artist depictions are taken from ivory carvings found in archaeological digs. Bull figurines were part of Canaanite worship. Bulls signified virility, strength, and youth. This one was found at an old hilltop cult site. Moses warned the people about such worship, that they should not worship on every hill, but at one site where the Ark of the Covenant would be installed. This image of Baal was found with his golden head intact. Baal was worshipped by the Canaanites. Asherah was Baal's consort. Many images of her have been found in Israel's digs. She came in many forms. Here is the cast that is made from the casting. Here is another mold, and its casting is Ashtaroth is often called Astarte and Asherah, but her function was that of a fertility goddess. Molds like this turned out many images for sale to families to take home. That would ensure fertility of the woman, but also of the flocks and the fields. This was an easy religion, not demanding purity and holiness like the God of the Hebrews, and the people of God often fell into it. The Canaanite goddess here decorates a bottle. Baal struts through the land, causing grain to grow, while Astarte promises more fertility. A gold Astarte fertility pendant was made to hang around the neck of a Canaanite petitioner. A series of letters have been found in Amarna, Egypt, in which city kings of Canaan beg help from others. This one says that he stands alone and needs a large force to rescue him. It's written in the Babylonian language, which was the diplomatic language of the day, and describes military deterioration and morale in Canaan, before the Exodus in the mid-14th century BC. God was true to His word, demoralizing and weakening Canaan, so that His people might be victorious over what seemed like a very strong and entrenched foe. A Canaanite city is geared for its defense, with archers on the battlements and other defenders on tiers around. Out front is the king, asking blessing of the gods with his censer. The Israelite soldier was tough. Though he had little weapons and no armor, he'd been born and reared in the hardships of the wilderness and believed that God was with him. His tactics were like those of guerrilla warriors, with no dependence on heavy armor or any sophisticated weapons. The big cities of Canaan had fleets of chariots and horses, but Israel kept to the hills where such a weapon had no advantage. Joshua used hit-and-run tactics and kept clear of the big plains cities, which did not fall to Israel's control for 200 years, not until David's time. This is an archaeology chart, which is probably impossible to read, but it does give a sense of how archaeologists study all the way back to the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age at the bottom of the chart, which is 10,000 BC. Abraham lived through the Middle Bronze Age, or the Canaanite period, about 1900 BC. Moses led the people to Canaan in the early Iron Age, about 1200 BC. With the science of archaeology developing and the material remains of these historic periods being studied, much can be learned about the history, life, and customs of Bible times. This often explains, illustrates, and corroborates biblical statements. On a single site, the archaeologist digs down through the layers of remains, strata, that correspond to periods of history come and gone. These ages and sub-ages are determined and dated by the artifacts found, chiefly pottery. A tell is a mound of layered ruins dating back to the earliest inhabitants of the particular site and ending with the top layer where the last people lived on the site. In successive strata are found the foundations of public buildings and homes, streets, garbage dumps, drainage ditches, and so forth, all along with the household utensils, weapons, and other artifacts of daily life. The colors in this picture depict different levels on this dig. The pottery found on the various levels are the indicators of the age of the level. Using pottery to date the level of the dig has become a science. The structure, material, decoration, and shape of a piece of pottery will effectively speak as to when a particular site was in use, and from them, the things that are found on that level are dated. For instance, the walls of the city, the buildings, and so forth. Also, information is gained about what interchange was going on in trade and what political power was dominant. For instance, when many Philistine pieces are found in Israel, we know the Philistines were predominant. The archaeological digs in Israel continue to supply Bible students with fascinating information about the times they are studying, and these endeavors are what have contributed so richly to these pictures. Ending video number 3, we give credit to the pictures from Reader's Digest Great People of the Bible, Reader's Digest Atlas of the Bible, the Illustrated Bible Dictionary, The Bible as History and Pictures, Time Life Art Book on Michelangelo, Rogerson's Atlas of the Bible, Biblical Archaeology Review, The World's Great Religions from Time Life Books.